question to HaRav, I think, last week, and kind of got like a partial answer on whether or not averot are be'etzem bad for a person, or they're bad in the sense that they know that it's bad for them. So the example that I gave the Rav was, we say that treif is timtum alev, it's bad for the neshama, but is that because Hashem commanded us not to eat treif? For example, if tinok shel nishba who's eating treif, do we say that the avera of eating treif affects his neshama, or does it only affect his neshama if he knows that it's treif and he knows that it's wrong?
Yeah. So this is a famous philosophical question. Did Hashem prohibit something because it's bad, or does something become bad because Hashem prohibited it? Meaning, how do you look at treif? Do you look at treif like poison, and God says don't eat poison? Or no, treif is not poison, it just becomes poison because you're violating the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That actually means, is evil an intrinsic good or evil? Are they intrinsic qualities, or are they just reflections of the commandment of Hashem, one way or the other? So let's analyze this. Let's take, first of all, like this. First of all, it's very, very clear that even if you do an avera b'shogeg, you do an avera inadvertently. If I eat non-kosher food and I think it's kosher, so I get punished for that. I mean, if it's chaylev, I bring a korban chatas, etc. So one might argue the very fact that you're mechuyev, if you do an avera b'shogeg, or you're mechalel Shabbos b'shogeg, indicates that averos have an intrinsic poisonous effect on you, even when they do not represent a rebellion against God. However, that's not a raya. And the reason that's not a raya is there are two different ways of understanding shogeg. Why do I have to bring a korban b'shogeg? It's an accident. I didn't intend to violate. So there are two different reasons. One reason is because intrinsically it's poison, and you got to get the poison out of your system by an atonement. That would go with the svara that be etzem, it's bad. But the other way of looking at it is every shogeg is also a rebellion, because had you been more conscientious, you would have checked it out. In other words, shogeg and mezid are not opposites. They're kind of points along the continuum. Mezid is when I know it's treif. Shogeg is I didn't check it out so much. So understand that your shaila is totally in how you understand the musig of shogeg. Is shogeg, the pshat, a merida, a rebellion against Hashem, because you could have been more conscientious and she didn't care enough? Or is shogeg an indicator of intrinsic poison? Now, the nafkamina would be tinok shenishba mamish. When you have a tinok shenishba, somebody who has like a kidnapped baby, that's a generic category for somebody who was never exposed to the learning of Torah and mitzvahs. If you learn that even a shogeg is only a sin because you could have checked it out, you should have known, then perhaps a tinok shenishba committed no sin, essentially, because there was no way he could have known. If, on the other hand, you look at it as the ingestion of spiritual poison, he would still need a tshuva for that process. Now, l'chayra, the fact that it's brought down lahalacha, that you're not allowed to give even a newborn baby something treif. That is the halacha. You're not allowed to give treif unless it's a sakana. So people ask me all the time, certain baby formulas might have non-kosher ingredients, right? Are you allowed to give it to a baby? So the rule is very pashut. If there's an alternative, you're not allowed to give it to a baby. If this is the only thing the baby takes and there's no alternative, so that's pikuach nefesh. That's a separate matter. But short of pikuach nefesh, it is absolutely usher to give a newborn baby treif. That would strongly indicate the idea of this is poison, timtum halev. The timtum, it clogs up the heart, meaning it affects your spiritual, that's a poetic term a little bit, to the idea that it affects your spiritual sensitivity. It affects the quality of your neshama. So I think that would be a raya, but as I say, there are different ways of understanding it.
That applies to specifically treif, or does that apply to all of it?
So the halacha about a katan is it applies to all averos, meaning there is a. On the other hand, once again, once you get into the technical halachas, it's a murky picture, because I'm not allowed to give my kid treif. I'm not allowed to tell my kid to be mechalel Shabbos, even a baby. I'm not allowed. On the other hand, if the baby is doing it on his own, I don't have to stop him. Right? So that may be a counterindication that there's no timtum halef, right? So there are rayas on both sides of the spectrum to this shaila, and some are mechalek between kashrus and other things. Some say kosher, non-kosher is poison to the soul. Things like chilul Shabbos and the like are only sinful because they represent rebelliousness, and therefore they don't have the same timtum halev if somebody is a tinok shenishba or the like. So there are many, many different shitas on it, so I can't give you a definitive, clear answer. In fact, it's interesting, the Ran brings a shita, by the way, just to give you another application of this. We know that the halacha is in kashrus, bitul b'shishim, right? A very, very famous halacha that if a non-kosher substance is mixed in 60 times kosher or more, it's considered batel, nullified, it's non-existent, and that applies to treif. If a drop of pork grease falls into a meat soup, and the soup is 60 times more, you're allowed to eat the soup. If a drop of milk, not allowed to pour it in directly, but if a drop of milk accidentally falls into a meat soup and it's shishim, I can have the soup with fleshik, and vice versa. If a drop of meat gravy falls into a milk soup, I can have it with milchiks. So here's the question people ask. Well, okay, I'm allowed to eat it, but since the treif is still there, is there a problem of timtum halev? Is it going to affect my heart? So there were those people, the Ran brings, who were machmir. They would not be somech on nullification in 60 because of the deleterious spiritual effect of the non-kosher mashahu. The Ran says such a person is an apikairis. It is actually a sinful thought because essentially you're making yourself smarter than Chazal and the laws of the Torah. Meaning the same way nullification takes away the prohibition, nullification takes away the timtum halev. So when you eat something that's batel b'shishim, if it's properly batel b'shishim, I don't mean you deliberately mixed it in, you absolutely should not worry about it at all. And fakert, there may be an inyan to bedavka eat it to show that you're maimin v'divrei chachamim. And yet, there's another area where we taka say bitul b'shishim doesn't take things away, and that is things that are asur mishum sakana. You know, Chazal had a Messiah, we don't really understand it scientifically, that eating meat together with fish is considered to be dangerous. We're not actually sure what the danger is, but that's why you have to wash your mouth out and eat some bread, because you don't eat meat and fish together. That's why, by the way, you got to be careful if you enjoy cooking. Don't use Worcestershire sauce with meat dishes, which is a very common condiment, because Worcestershire sauce has anchovies in it, which are fish, and therefore, if you're a frum person, if you keep halacha, you can't use it on a meat dish. So the machlokes is, well, what if the fish is less than 1/60th? It's batel b'shishim, let's say, in Worcestershire sauce or whatever it would be. So some say on inyanim of sakana, bitul b'shishim doesn't work. Bitul b'shishim works on the isra of eating it, and bitul b'shishim works on timtum halev even. But in yanim of sakana, maybe you need a higher level of dilution, just like poison. Poison won't necessarily be nullified in 1 in 60. But when you're dealing with sakana, you're dealing with physical poison in a way. So that's an Indian where bitul does not take care of every possible problem. Yeah.
I've heard quite a few times that the Jewish people are known as the indigenous people of Israel, beloved by like Bibi Netanyahu and all that. And,
Yeah.
and the thing is, like we learned in the Tanakh class that the 7 Canaanite nations were here. So do you think it is right for us to call ourselves that?
No. So this is a very, very interesting question that Chazal, Rashi actually talk about. Meaning, indigenous means the native population, right? Like in the United States, they're called Native Americans. When I was growing up, they were called American Indians, whatever it is. But the Indians were the Native Americans, and they were displaced. By the way, it is so interesting that whatever Israel did with the Palestinians, America did 100 times worse. And somehow, nobody, whatever. I mean, it's quite amazing about the hypocrisy of the world and the double and triple and quadruple standards that it applies to Israel when every single one of these countries did things that were worse in every possible way. But I'm not here to talk about the Native American massacres. So if you read the Sefer Yoshua, B'Pashtus, it seems to be that the 7 nations of Canaan were the original population that inhabited Eretz Yisrael, and Hashem gave us a mitzvah to go and conquer the lands and even eradicate the populations. Now, granted, we believe it's a divine command, but nevertheless, are we the indigenous people here? So, it's an interesting comment. When Avram Avinu was told, Parshas Lech Lecha, when Avram Avinu was told, go to the land that I will show you, and it says Avram goes there, so it mentions Hakanani az ba'aretz. The Canaanites were then in the land when Avram came. So here is what Rashi comments. Rashi has a fascinating comment. Rashi says, why does the Torah emphasize the Canaanites were then in the land? Because he said, Eretz Yisrael was originally the land of Shem, the son of Noach. And the Canaanites conquered it from Shem. So according to that interpretation, which I will admit you don't see clearly from the Chumash, I'll be moded to you. But according to that interpretation, it turns out that the Canaanites, the 7 nations of Canaan, were not the original inhabitants of the land. The original inhabitants of the land were Avram Avinu's ancestors, the Semitic people, the Shem people. And in point of fact, therefore, it's not so much that we took it away from the indigenous population, but we reappropriated it into at least the family line to which it originally belonged. So maybe Netanyahu remembers his Chumash and Rashi, or maybe his Netanyahu has a grandson, by the way. He has a frum daughter who married a Meishar, very unusual, and he has a grandson who's a real Eli. The grandson made a Siyam Hashas at the age of 13. Amazing thing. A real mamish, very, very learned from boy. So maybe his grandson told him, but whatever it is, according to Rashi, Hakanani az bi'aretz negates the idea that the Canaanites are the indigenous people. Yeah, in the back.
Are there any halachic, specifically halachic concerns with telling Jewish people who are not frum about the spiritual punishments for Averas, like Kares and Isa?
So, yeah, this is a very good question generally, meaning when I teach Torah to somebody who's not yet frum, but somebody who wants to learn a little bit or is curious or wants to understand things, so I'm not allowed to lie, I'm not allowed to distort. That's very, very true. Torah has to be emes, the seal of God is emes, and we don't have the right to take the Torah and distort it. But the question becomes, that doesn't necessarily mean I should say everything that's there. There are messages that people are not always ready to hear. There are messages that may drive them away from Torah if they're too negative, too scary, too destructive. So the short answer is, hakol lefi ha'inyan. It really very much depends on how, you have to guess a little bit, how the person is going to respond to this type of information. If the person is sincerely trying to become more religious and will incorporate this in their understanding, go ahead and tell them. If, on the other hand, it's likely to be taken as so negative that it will drive them away, it's better not to say. So you don't lie if the person asks you a question. You do have to answer it honestly, I think, but you don't have to volunteer certain negative information because you don't want to scare a person away, right? Because remember, there are many frightening things in Judaism, to be sure. We can't deny it. We cannot deny it. We ourselves cannot deny it. But there's also counter messages of love and forgiveness and acceptance. There's a whole picture here. So different people are able to hear only parts of the picture at any given time. So you have to calibrate your message. This is not only true for non-frum people. This is true for Talmidim. This is true for anyone that you're interacting with when you're trying to teach them about Torah about Judaism. So you got to be careful. Yeah.
Should one be concerned? Excuse me. Should one be concerned that by telling a person about a negative consequence of their actions in a spiritual sense, you're in effect making them more chayav?
You know, I really don't think so, because I see that you're thinking about the concept that Chazal say, better to be an inadvertent sinner than an intentional sinner. Now, that may justify not telling them that something is usher at all, because that way they're violating it unintentionally. But I think once they've crossed the threshold and they know that it's usher, but what they're lacking is an appreciation of the punishment, I'd have to think about it some more, actually, but I don't think that's going to increase their culpability in God, because, I mean, they're already stuck, so to speak. They already know that it's usher, so they've already crossed the line into mazid. Right? And in fact, I have not seen it, mutav, that they only think it's a lo sasa, and not that they think it's a chiyuv misa. I've never seen it expressed that way. It's only shogeg versus mazid. Okay? Yeah.
Is one allowed to think about Hashem in the bathroom? I've heard people think about nature. Personally, that would just make you think about all of Hashem and His creations. So is that allowed?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated issue of what you're allowed to think about in the bathroom. It's not a simple question. You're not supposed to think about Torah, but of course, what is Torah? Torah, God, so really, you're not supposed to think about Hashem. Now, what the poskim say, you can think about, is actually very hard to separate. Think about nature, think about the human body, the functioning of the human body, think about your biology or physiology, whatever it would be. But to overtly and directly think about the ultimate creator, you're not allowed to do. So I understand that the mind runs in certain directions that is very, very hard to stop. But so to some degree, you might be an onus on that, and Hashem will not hold you responsible, but you try to rein yourself back and not go in that direction. Yeah.
Is it permitted to listen to church music?
Yeah, is it permitted to listen to church music? Interesting, Shaila. The obvious problem is, of course, that church music was either written for Christian worship or idolatrous worship. And remember, even though we discussed this morning the machlokes, the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam, regarding the halachic status of Christianity as idolatry for the non-Jewish world, but it is idolatry for me, so I'm listening to idolatrous music. Am I getting benefit? So it is a machlokes poskim. There are poskim that say you're not allowed to listen to church music because it was written for avodah zarah. Other poskim say the following. They say the only time there would be an iser is if it's actually being played as part of a religious service. But the fact that it was written for a certain purpose, and now you're just listening to the music as a recording or in a symphony, whatever it would be, the origin of it does not get tainted. In other words, you see the difference, because you're not getting benefit from an idolatrous service because you're not listening to the music in an idolatrous service. So Lemaisa, most poskim actually say that mi'ikar hadin, it is not forbidden to listen to the idolatrous tune if it is separated from an actual church service being conducted. You do have to be very careful about the words that may say glory to whomever, that one should not be involved in. And in fact, that's an interesting history. I mean, the Bach talks about chossonim that incorporated church music in their davening, in their Yomim Noraim davening. And of course, there's an old tradition in some circles, we don't know if it's true, that the Gregorian chants, which is the most ancient music in the Catholic Church, is actually a remnant of the songs of the Levium from the Beis HaMikdash, meaning it was not composed for Christian worship, it was actually from the Beis HaMikdash. Probably got changed either way, but it's actually connected all the way back in that way, because, keep in mind, I mean, these are rumors that have been going on for many, many years. The Vatican denies it, that the Romans destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, and there have always been rumors that around the Vatican are various stuff. Wouldn't be the Aron HaKodesh, because that was hidden before the Churban Bayis Rishon, but some say the Vatican still has the menorah. You know, okay, who knows? Big Day Kahuna, who knows what they have there. But it's not rachaik that they may have preserved some of the music from the Beis HaMikdash itself. But as I say, most say it's mutter. And I think I mentioned before the story. I was once davening mincha in the Mea Sharim Shtiblach. And all of a sudden, in the middle of mincha, somebody's cell phone goes off, and they start hearing Silent Night. I'm sure from your prior lives, you know that song, Silent Night. So it's very, very funny. Apparently, the guy liked the tune. He didn't know he had no idea what it was, and he actually put it on his cell phone. Now, that's not a raya that it's mutter. I'm not bringing a raya, but it's interesting that they use that tune. And many sukkah decorations, to give you another analogy, in Eretz Yisrael, are things that are manufactured for the non-Jewish celebration of Christmas, different lights and the like. But once again, you're using it for a mitzvah purpose, a non-prohibited purpose, so it wouldn't be tainted in that way. Yeah.
What's the evidence that the Gregorian chants come from?
I have to go back to what the evidence is. It's I don't think we have any. I don't think there's any authoritative makor from our side that says such a thing. But musicologists have speculated that it may have been the music from the Beis HaMikdash. I can look into if there's any evidence to it. Yeah.
When it says in Shach that by, I think, I'm not sure, there's 7 books of Torah.
Yeah,
and
7.
it's
Yeah.
by Ibn Zohar,
Right.
One book. And
Right.
Book.
Right.
Does that mean that you can draw out basically the equivalent of a whole book of Tanakh from there? Like, what is the?
I'm sorry. Say again.
Like, functionally, that means that they'll expand and will have more. It means that there's enough drasha within those psukim to be a whole book, or it's only.
Well, the Gemara actually says, again, the Gemara says that based on a pasuk in Mishlei, I'm just repeating, that there are 7 books of the Torah, and the way that works is Bereshis is book 1, Shmos is book 2, Vayikra is book 3, Bamidbar is divided into 3 books, that gives you 6, and Devarim is book 7, and Bamidbar is divided into 3 very, very different sized books. Book number 1 goes from the beginning of Bamidbar to the middle of Baloscha. Book number 2 is only 2 psukim. Vayhi ben Soa, we say this, Ha'aron, when the Aron travels, Moshe said, your enemies should scatter. And book 3 is from after that till the end of the Sefer, right? Mamish, and we can give you a whole word on why are we dividing it into such an unequal way. But it turns out that there are a little more than 7, I remember if it's 72 or 75 letters. And the Gemara Darshans, you see from here, that as little as 75 or 72 letters, I have to remember the exact number, can be a sefer. So it makes nafkaminas because there are certain halachos about saving a sefer that would go beyond saving a pasuk, and this number of letters, even in another book, already have the status of a sefer because you see that that is the size of a sefer. Now, I will say that you cannot use this as a heter for a siyum during the 9 days or Erev Pesach. It says, Baruch Hashem, I learned the whole Sefer Bamidbar. Chazal say, 2 psukim, v'hi ben Sayharan. So we're not makel for that. There it has to be a Sefer. But for some purposes, it's called a Sefer. That's right. Yeah.
There's a strong idea that you can change the power of nature, you can change nature through Tefilah. Why is it that because it's Likudim Aran brings that because Abraham had a blemish when Hashem said, I'll give you the land, Abraham kind of questioned it, and because of that we had to suffer in Egypt for 400 years. Why could this not be resolved through Tefilah? And then also you have by Yosef, you had Yaakov had to send Yosef away for 20 years, and there's opinion that he knew that he's going to lose Yosef for the 20 years he was away from his father. Why couldn't the Avos change this through Tefilah?
Yeah. So the question is a good question. Obviously, one of the things the Torah teaches us again and again is the amazing power of Tefilah to even change nature. The very fact that Avram and Sarah, right? Avram was 100, Sarah was 90. Not only were they old, particularly Sarah was old, but indeed Chazal say she didn't even have a womb, which is very, very schwer, because why does the Torah seem to indicate that the whole miracle of Sarah was her age? There was a much bigger miracle. She didn't have a rechem. And yet the Torah does not emphasize that. But be it as it may, when Hashem lifted Avram above the stars, Chazal say that stars represent fixed destiny. You are above the fixed destiny. You, the Jew, your descendants, have a unique relationship to Hashem that is above Teva. Tefilah is Mishane the Teva. So the question that you're asking is, well, okay, so Tefilah is Mishane the Teva, so that Avram and Sarah had children, etc. And yet we find that there were times in which Tefilah apparently was not strong enough. Because Avram Avinu at the bris ben Absarim questioned Hashem and said, how do I know my children will inherit? The Gemara in Nedarim says that's one of the reasons why it was decreed that we will be enslaved for 210 years, but a total of 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. Tefilah did not help for that. And the other example is because Yaakov was separated from his father Yitzchak for 22 years and didn't do kibbut avayim. Yosef was separated from Yaakov for 22 years, and exactly the same 22 years, and yet we don't find there was Tefilah. Why couldn't Yaakov daven? Why couldn't Yosef daven? Whichever side, why couldn't they both daven? The short answer is, I don't know, meaning to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not build in any type of guarantee. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has many, many cheshbonos why certain things have to play out in a certain way. The Golus Mitzrayim was necessary for a tikkun, a rectification in our neshamos. And just like a bridge, when you start off building a bridge from two ends, if you start off even the tiniest bit off, let's say the two ends are, let's say, not in alignment by 1/100th of an inch, by the time you get to the middle, they're going to be totally apart. Same thing with the avos. The smallest little crack in the avos eventually becomes a catastrophe for the later generations. So if Avram Avinu showed the tiniest little bit of questioning Hashem, that requires hundreds of years of rectification of the children, because the avos are the foundation. If the foundation is defective in any way, that's catastrophic. So to say, why couldn't things be shortcutted? Well, first of all, Lagabi Yetzias Mitzrayim, maybe there was a shortcut, because as you know, Hashem said to Avram, we were supposed to be there for 400 years. Now, granted, we have a teretz that it's 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak, but many Mefarshim say that indeed we should have been there 400 years, and there was a koach of Tefilah. So in point of fact, Tefilah by Mitzrayim worked a lot also. Many say that Yetzias Mitzrayim at that particular time and place, or that particular time, was through the koach of crying out to Hashem. But it is inevitably the case that sometimes there are cheshbonos, there are tikkunim, there are rectifications that require a certain amount of suffering and a certain amount of going through different experiences that you will not be allowed to short circuits even through davening. So ultimately this is the wisdom of Hashem that we don't fully understand. Yeah.
Why is it that when the chosson and kallah walk down to the chukul, everyone stands up?
Very, very good. So, right, everyone knows. Well, first of all, I guess, this is the minhag today. This is not necessarily such an old minhag. Chosson, everybody stands up. Kallah, even, people stand up. Chosson, kallah stand up. So one reason everybody likes to give is, a chosson is like a melech, kallah is like a malka. So we stand up in honor of the melech and the malka. But there's an obvious kasha yet. They're not married yet. Chosson is a melech when he gets married. He's on the way to get married. So what? He's still, he's only, whatever it is, prince. He's Prince of Wales. He's not king yet. So it's not shaykh to say chosson doime lemelech today. So Rav Saadia Gaon gives a different reason. He points to the Mishnah in Maseches Bikurim. The Mishnah says Bikurim, when cities used to bring Bikurim, So they would come to Yerushalayim as a city. They would organize it by cities. So the whole city, all of Tiberia, would come and they'd bring their bikurim, not on Shavuos, we're talking about during the week. So it says the umnin, the blacksmiths, whoever, the people who were working, they would stand up in honor of the Yeshvei Bikurim, and they would say, Baruchim Haboim, welcome, welcome. Now, why did they stand up? Because there's a mitzvah to stand up in honor of people doing a mitzvah. When they're going to do a mitzvah, we're machabed oisei mitzvah. So Rav Saadia said, at least the chosson is going to be makayim the mitzvah of kedushin. The Rambam says kedushin is a mitzvah d'oraisa. L'chara, the kallah lav dafka has that mitzvah, but okay. And therefore he tainas that we stand up to honor a person who is going to do a mitzvah. L'chara, you have to be magir that. I'm not sure what that means. You stand up in honor of a person going to do a mitzvah. I mean, when you let's say I'm in the Beis Medrash learning, and you come and you're going to put on your talis and tefillin right now. So I mean, do I have to stand up because you're going to put on talis and tefillin? I mean, I'm not sure what it means exactly. I stand up in honor of Isay Mitzvah, but at least by Bikurim we see it, and he wants to say a chasna is the same thing. Now, the emes is, I've heard people say, this is a new minhag that somebody made up. People make up a minhagim sometimes. In Europe, they didn't do it. In the Alterheim, in Lita, you didn't do it. Of course, the reason they didn't do it is because there were no seats at chuppahs. I mean, you know, in the olden days, everybody was standing up anyway. There was no, so you don't really know if they would have stood up. So I don't know. Some do claim it's a new mitzvah. It's a new minhag that's just recent minhag, relatively. By now, I mean recent. I'm aware of it for around 40 years, but it's not much older than that. So I don't know. So if you look, I think if you'll notice, you may notice if you ever look at Rosh Yeshivas or whatever older who are sitting, you may notice that they often do not stand up for the chosson or the kallah. Yeah.
So we say in Sefer Iyov that it's kilu, the Satan and Hashem are having this kind of dialogue regarding Iyov, saying Hashem was kind of praising Iyov, saying how righteous he is and how like all of his ways are righteous. And the Satan kind of, seemingly from how I understand, is egging Hashem on in the sense that, oh no, he's not so righteous, you know, I bet I can get him to crack, and as soon as I start testing him, this and that. So it seems like the Satan's was kind of egging Hashem on, and finally Hashem said, okay, you know, do your worst, just keep him alive. So my question is did Hashem let the Satan, in a sense, egg him on? I mean, knowing that Iyov was righteous, why would Hashem allow him to egg him on? And
Yeah. It's a very, very good question. The book of Iyov is a very, very difficult book. Even the words are very difficult. Iyov is one of the most difficult just to touch up, just to translate the words. And philosophically, it's a very deep book. But the book of Iyov, it's even a machlokes in the Gemara, did it even happen? According to one opinion, this story never happened at all, but it was a mashal to illustrate certain ideas. But whether it happened or didn't happen is actually not that important to us. But there's a story about a man who was very, very righteous. Lav dafka a Jew, that's another machlokes, may have been a guy even. And all of a sudden, things start happening to him, tragedies. He loses his property. He loses his children. He himself becomes very, very ill with all sorts of disgusting skin diseases. And his friends try to comfort him and try to explain what's going on. And he argues with them, and it's about a philosophical debate. Does Hashem bring suffering to a person who's innocent, or only you must be a sinner, right? Whole machlokes. Are you a sinner? Are you not a sinner? Why does Hashem, as the famous question, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? And it goes on and on and on and on, till finally Hashem comes at the end and also doesn't answer the question. Meaning, Iyov is about why do tsaros happen to people who seem to be righteous people? So if that's the question of Iyov, so you may then ask, so what's the teretz of Iyov? The short answer is there actually is no teretz, and maybe we'll talk another time about that. But it begins, you're focusing on the very beginning of the book. It begins with what seems like a bet between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Satan. Right? They're in Shemayim. By the way, the Satan is not a fallen angel. The Satan is part of the heavenly court. He's up there with God. He's like the prosecutor. In fact, the Christians say Satan, Satan. Ha-Satan is a job description. It's actually not a name. Ha-Satan means the accuser. Satan has a job. Hashem has a court, whatever that means exactly. And in that court, there are defense attorneys. Hashem is the judge. There are defense attorneys. There are prosecuting attorneys. Every person has a prosecutor. Same prosecutor, but there's a prosecutor and a defense attorney. The Satan is an honored part of Hashem's court. He is the prosecutor. His job is to bring up all the negative points, and then there are, Mir Hashem, there are malachim that'll bring up the positive points. So Ha-Satan is actually not a proper noun. It's not a name. It's a job. So he wasn't kicked out of heaven, like the Christians say. Satan rebelled against God and was thrown out of heaven and became the Antichrist. That whole thing is not our Messiah. Satan has a job. So Hashem is saying to the Satan, like, why does Hashem even begin this conversation? Hey, Satan, have you ever seen such a guy as good as Iyov, righteous, God-fearing, he does all my commandments, wonderful person. So the Satan says, you think he's so good? I betcha if you let me take away all of his stuff, he's not going to be so good anymore. So Hashem says, okay, I accept the bet, but the only condition is don't kill him, because if you kill him, we don't really know the experiment, right? The experiment has to be he loses everything and he's still righteous. If you kill him, we don't know, right? So he says, the one condition is don't kill him, do everything else. So Iyov, by the way, doesn't know about this bet. The reader knows. We know. Iyov doesn't know, right? So Iyov is totally ignorant about this. And all of a sudden, loses his property. Ganovim come take everything. And God forbid, a building collapses on his sons, his children. They all die. He becomes ill. He's so repulsive in his condition that his friends can't even stand to, his other friends cannot stand to be next to him, other than the three that come. So what's going on? Is it a bet, a capricious bet? God is playing a game? God is saying, I betcha, let's see what we can do. What's going to happen if I cut off this finger and cut off this finger, and let's see. So you're right. When you read it, it's very, very, very difficult to understand. But I think the emes is, the Satan is making a very valid point. This is not a bet. The Satan is saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, listen, you want Iyov to be a tzaddik. You want Iyov to be righteous. You want Iyov to be good. The measure of how good a person is not how he serves Hashem when life is easy and convenient. Of course I'm going to serve Hashem if it makes me wealthy and healthy and respected and admired. That's a pretty good deal. I do my mitzvahs because I get all these things from it. But the Satan says to Hashem, if you really want Iyov to be righteous, then put him through all of these things. And then, if he still believes in you, he truly will become a tzaddik. So, even though I'm moided to you that the vocabulary of Perek Aleph sounds a lot like a bet, sounds like a game, it actually is a very, very serious point. And this is part of the answer of why righteous people suffer. Hashem wants them to develop qualities of emunah and bitachon and inner strength, even when life is very, very hard. Because then they become different people. They become greater people. They become worthier people than they would have been otherwise. And that is kind of what Hashem did to Iyov, transforming him into a much greater tzaddik. Before his suffering, Iyov was a tzaddik because he got a good deal out of it. After his suffering, he became a tzaddik because he had emunah in Hashem. no matter what the darkness of his condition was. You know, the Brisker Rav used to tell a story. The Brisker Rav was, of course, the son of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, who was the Rav of Brisk, as was his grandfather, the Beis Halevi. 3 generations of Soloveitchiks were the Rabbanim of Brisk, and then, of course, came the Holocaust, so the Brisker Rav came to Eretz Yisrael. So the Brisker Rav grew up in the house of the Gadol Hador, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. And he had mentioned that in Brisk, there was a very, very wealthy man, who was a real tzaddik. He learnt, like all the time, he gave tzedakah, he was generous, he was kind. And this was someone that the Brisker Rav, as a child, really, really admired, a person who was mamish in Eved Hashem. And then one day something happens, the person's business collapsed, the person lost everything. And the person who had been a real big gevir was sleeping in the street with his family. He had nothing at all. The man didn't complain. But the Brisker Rav complained as a child. He went to his father. And he said to his father, I don't understand. The Brisker Rav used to tell the story. I don't understand this. Here is a man who, he took his money, he took his wealth, and everything he did with his wealth was what Hashem wanted. He lived a life totally devoted to the Ratzon Hashem. Why would Hashem take everything away from him? He said to his father, he says, I don't understand this. So Rav Chaim gave him a mashal about a person. It's a strange mashal in a way for Rav Chaim, because it's a mashal about going to college. It's a little mudna why Rav Chaim would use such a mashal. But he says, imagine a person trains for many, many years to be able to be a certain professional. You train to be a doctor. So after he masters one field, he then wants to go on to another field, right? He mastered medicine. He now wants to master law. Says, in life, there are many, many skills that a person needs in Avodas Hashem. There's a skill in how to serve Hashem with wealth, because wealth can make you arrogant. Wealth can make you conceited. There's a skill. And Baruch Hashem, this Gevir mastered legamri how to serve Hashem with Ashiras. But Hashem wants to perfect him in all ways. And Hashem said, now that you've mastered how to serve me with Ashiras, I want you to master how to serve me with Aniyas, to bring out even that quality you're able to do. So he says it was Hashem's love for this person that he wanted him to develop every single side of his koach and avodas Hashem. So that's kind of what the Satan is arguing with Hashem. So it's not a game, it's not a bet, it's the essence of what a person is. By the way, the Brisker Rav had his own story. I think I may have mentioned this, I don't remember. When the Brisker Rav got married, apparently he married into a very, very wealthy family that owned a lot of apartment buildings in Warsaw. And the rental from those buildings would have been enough to give him a parnasa for his whole life. And his expectation was he would simply learn Torah his whole life, and he would have a parnasa from the rentals from these many apartment buildings. He designated an agent, a shaliach, to manage these buildings, a Jewish guy. And apparently this Jewish guy was a dishonest person. And since he had access to all the paperwork, he put all the apartments in his own name. He mamish deprived the Brisker Rav of all of the apartments, all of the buildings. The Brisker Rav could have gone to court and sued the guy and gotten it back, but the Brisker Rav held he was not allowed to go to non-Jewish courts. So he lost. That itself is an interesting debate about there. But whatever it was, because the Brisker Rav did not want to take the person to a non-Jewish court, the Brisker Rav lost, I guess, the equivalent of millions of dollars. He was poverty-stricken. That's why he became the Rav of Brisk, because he didn't want to become a Rav, but he had no parnasa pashut, bichlal. And the Brisker Rav was so despondent, so tzibrochen, his whole life dream changed, that he locked himself into a room and he learned chayvas halavavais shar habitachin. That's the part of chayvas dealing with trust in Hashem. For a whole week, all he learned was chayvas halavavais shar habitachin, over and over and over and over again. And after the week, he came out a happy man, and he said, "The treasure that I got from shar habitachin was worth much, much, much more than the buildings I lost." And then he said, it's easy to have bitachon. He used a small number. When you have $100,000 in the bank, of course that was in the 1920s when $100,000 went further. But it's easy to have bitachon when you have money in the bank. But real bitachon is when there's no money in the bank. And then you have bitachon, right? So this is all about developing bitachon. Yeah.
What's the deal with the bracha of hanosein layoef koach? Like, why do we say it? Where is it from? Why can't we say it?
Yeah. So the birchas hashachar hanosein layoef koach. Hashem gives to the exhausted strength, and the lashon is from a pasuk in Yeshayahu. Baruch hanosein layoef koach. It's a pasuk in Yeshayahu, although without Hashem's name in it. You are correct in noting that it is not one of the birchos hashachar that are mentioned in the Gemara. In other words, the Gemara itself, in the Maseches Brachos, lists the various morning brachos. And by the way the Gemara lists it, it's not like you say all of them at the same time, but every time you do something. So when you put on your shoes, you say sha'asoli kol sorki. When you get out of bed, zokev kefufim, he straightens up, right? In other words, the brachos were recited as you did things. And the Beis Yosef brings such a shita, but the Ramah says our minhag is we recite them in the Beis HaKnesset. But based on that, you are correct. Hanosein layoef koach is not a Talmudic bracha. It's not in the Gemara at all. We know it basically from the Gaonim. The Gaonim, Rav Amram Gaon and then Rav Saadia Gaon, they have it in the Sidurim. And what's interesting is that, we often assume in halacha that once you have the Gemara, like there are no halachic additions to things after the Gemara. The truth is, that's not really true. The Gaonim still had this idea that they could make new brachos, they could add things. So hanosein layoef koach is from the Gaonim, based on the pasuk in Yeshayahu. Yeah.
Is there a steer up between when the Torah says you should not take revenge, and then when it also says whoever spills blood of a person, their blood should be spilled?
Yeah. So the question is, the Torah says, do not take revenge, and yet the Torah says, he who spills blood, their blood shall be avenged. So one answer basically is that there is a big difference between personal revenge and the revenge that is carried out by a Beis Din that is fulfilling Hashem's commandments, meaning same thing here. I'm not supposed to just kill somebody. Even the Goel Hadam, the blood avenger who is allowed to kill, is only allowed to kill after a Beis Din has adjudicated that there is a Chiyuv Misa. So in a sense, there is that difference. And the svara for that would be that the Torah does not want you to act out of feelings of vengeance. You have to act out of justice. And when a Beis Din decides guilt, the Beis Din is determining, what is just in a given situation. So we carry out justice, but we don't do it with lust. We don't do it with blood joy. Like, if you remember an infamous picture in the New York Times, this is way before October 7th, this was maybe 10 years ago or more, a suicide bomber, actually not a suicide bomber, just a terrorist, who killed people, and he dipped his hands in that Jewish blood, and the blood was dripping from his fingers, and he was dancing around like a crazy chicken without its head, like what a simcha, that right? And that we don't have. Even when we kill people with misas Beis Din, one does not have that type of simcha. So it's not revenge. It's the justice through the procedure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said. Yeah.
I have a few questions on the definition of lishma.
Of what? Of
lishma.
Lishma, yeah.
Yeah, because the Nefesh Chaim seems to hammer that home all the time. That all the great things that happen from
Yeah.
So I have like 3 questions on it. Well, first of all, what is definition? I'm reading it, and I don't think that he emphasizes the actual definition, first of all, of what lishma is. And then the second question is, again, all on the idea of lishma, is we know that from lo lishma comes lishma. So does that mean that when we're learning lo lishma, we're still getting credit because the eventual goal is to get to lishma? And then the last thing, this is probably the one that's the hardest one for me to understand, is how can one really be'emet get to lo lishma when there's reward in punishment? Meaning, if I was like ask my son do something for me, but do it because you really love me and only because of that. But if you do it, I'll give you $1 million. And if you don't do it, I'll kill you. That kind of ruins the whole.
Yeah. That last point, right? Let me take it in reverse order a little bit. The idea of learning Torah lishma just for the sake of God without any ulterior motive, and then we have this tremendous reward that we get for learning and the punishment for not learning. How can you possibly learn lishma? My own Rebbe used to say that. My Rebbe was Rav Yaakov Moshe Kolevsky, Zechrono Livracha. There's even an art scroll biography of him. I think it's a beautiful biography, but that's because I'm a little nogeh b'davar. I myself am mentioned, I think, twice there. But again, a lot of good stories. And he used to wonder. He used to say, the hardest thing for him is to learn Torah lishma, because he knows the tremendous reward that you get for learning Torah. So your question and your doubt is a very strong doubt. But let's first talk about the Nefesh HaChaim. Right? Nefesh HaChaim is the famous sefer by Rav Chaim of Volozhin, the great Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva. It was printed after his death. And Nefesh HaChaim talked about a lot of things, but in the yeshiva world, the only part of the Nefesh HaChaim they learn is the 4th gate. I mean, there are 3 other gates, plus an intermediate thing. But the 4th gate is almost the mission statement of the Litvische Torah world, and that is all about the greatness of learning Torah. And he goes into what you might call almost overkill, which gazillions of Zohars and Gemaras and Midrashim, and over and over and over again, you fix the world, you repair the world, you elevate your neshama, the reward is infinite. And he makes the point, by the way, it's not only when you learn practical halacha things, but even if you learn the most theoretical, esoteric chelik of Torah that has nothing to do with anything lamaisa. He makes the point. In fact, that's the defense of our theoretical preoccupation. He says, you're connecting, you're masaking all of the worlds. So in the middle of Shar Dalet, which is that famous part of the Nefesh HaChaim, he talks about the meaning of learning Torah lishma. And he says some people interpret, and by the way, there's some people are Hasidim, interpret lishma means I'm learning for the sake of God, to be close to God. I'm learning Torah with the kavanah that I want to connect to Hashem. And they say that that's what lishma is. So Rav Chaim Volozhin says that's not what lishma means. And he brings an interesting raya. It says in Pirkei Avos, Asay devarim, listen to this dear carefully, Asay devarim l'shem po'alan, do the mitzvahs for the sake of the Creator, v'daber bahem, learn, speak about the Torah, lishma. So he's making the point, you'll notice that with mitzvos, it says, I do mitzvos to be connected to God. But Torah, it doesn't say, do Torah lishmo, to be for the sake of God. Lishma is feminine. So he says, learning Torah lishma means I learn Torah in order to understand Torah. Meaning I don't do it for kavod, I don't do it for osher, I don't do it for reputation, I don't even do it consciously for God, although I'll talk about that in a moment. I do it because I want to understand the Torah. And that will automatically connect me to God. And now, Rav Chaim is moda, that the ultimate goal of lishma is to be connected to Hashem. He's not denying Devekus as a goal. That's very important. Devekus is very important. but it shouldn't be a part of your conscious thinking process while you are learning. Now let me explain why that's so. Why that is so is actually a very practical consideration, because he was an educator. If I measure my Torah learning by how close I feel it's making me to God, frankly, there'll be a lot of avenues that I'm not going to pursue because I don't think it's taken me there. Right? You're doing a Rebbe Kiv Eger, you're doing a Ktsos, you're doing a difficult Taisus, a real technical thing. So at some point you're going to sit back and say, is this bringing me closer to God? I don't think it is. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner is actually saying, see, I hope you're following me here, being too God-focused in your learning can be dangerous because it's going to interfere with your mastery of Torah, which can sometimes be very technical, very arcane. So his chiddush is that don't get too involved in thinking about your connection to Hashem while you're learning. Lishma means I am learning to understand this Torah to the best of my ability. Unlike the Baal Tanya, who Taka says, Lishma is l'shem devekus to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, Rav Chaim is moda, very important. That, of course, the goal is connection to Hashem. But that will come as a product of your learning, and not by constantly thinking about it. But he then says the following. He then says, you should set aside a certain amount of time every day to think about your connection to Hashem. It shouldn't be every minute I'm learning, I'm thinking about that. But you set aside time. In fact, he gives a very interesting cheshbon. He brings a Gemara that says, Yiras Hashem is the Eitzar, is the preservative, the guardian of Torah. So here is the halacha. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia says that when you buy grain, the mocher is allowed to, a certain percentage of what you buy can be dirt and rocks, because that keeps the grain fresh. So the basic cheshbon is up to 1/24 of what you buy. If I buy whatever it is, a ton of grain, 1/24 can be dirt and rocks, because they preserve the grain. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner says, therefore, that 1/24 of your time of learning should be devoted to devekus. Now that's fascinating, because if you posit in Volozhin a 12-hour Musar Seder, so 12-hour Gemara Seder, 12-hour Gemara learning, so 1/24 of that time is a half an hour. So that may be the makor of what was makubal in the Litvish yeshivos to have a half an hour Musar Seder, based on the notion of preservative and the like. So Rav Chaim's point, I think, is intrinsic practical. He's basically saying, and you see this actually, you see, when people are very spiritual people who are always, thinking about Hashem, which is a wonderful thing, they're going to have a lot of problems in Gemara, because they're not going to see this immediate spiritual thing. In fact, that's a problem that many Baalei Tshuva face. I don't want to paint a negative picture, but you're coming to yeshiva, so you figure, we're going to open Gemara. The Talmud will tell me the purpose of life. The Talmud will tell me, why am I in this world? It will answer the yearnings of my neshama. So you're sitting down for your first shir. This is going to answer all the things that have bothered me. And you start reading about two guys come in holding a talis, or a chicken lays an egg on Yom Tov. Now, if you have a legal type mind, you'll enjoy the legal discussion, but you're going to wonder, how is this connected to all of the things that are troubling me? And Rav Chaim Volozhiner will answer, indirectly it all is, because you're connecting to Hashem. But if you think about it too overtly, you see the problem. Think about it too overtly, you're going to say, I don't need this stuff. I want to learn Musar, I want to learn Rav Nachman, I want to, whatever it will be. So that's why Rav Chaim Volozhiner has a bit of a unique definition of what Torah lishma is, and Ein Echanami. Among the Gedolei Chasidus, they did have a much more Dveikus-based definition of Torah lishma. But the point I want to make is, Rav Chaim is also moda to the importance of Dveikus. His point is, it shouldn't be a conscious aspect of your thought while you're learning. That's the nafkamina in perceptive. Yeah?
How do you resolve the machlokes between Rav Saadia Gaon and Arizal about gilgulim?
About Gilgul. Yeah. So Gilgul is the idea of reincarnation, that neshamos come back in different bodies, different times, whatever it would be. Now, Gilgul was not invented by the Arizal. The belief in Gilgul was said by earlier Svarim, but we do have a famous statement of Rav Saadia Gaon, one of the great Gaonim who lived in the 900s. This is 600 years before the Arizal. And in his Sefer, he wrote the first really book on Jewish philosophy. It's called Emunos Videos. It is really before the Moreh Nevuchim. It's the first book of systematic Jewish philosophy. And he talks about Mashiach and Techiyas HaMesim. But when it comes to Gilgul, he says beferish that there's no such thing. And any Jewish people who say there's Gilgul have gotten it from non-Jewish religions, and there is no such thing. But then, 600 years later, we have the Arizal and his Talmud Rav Chaim Vital, who wrote Shar Gilgulim, which, Gilgul becomes a big deal. So if you were to ask me, does Judaism believe in Gilgul? So my answer would be what? Rav Saadia Gaon says no, and the Arizal says yes. Well, who's right? Right? I mean, on this, it's very difficult to say elu v'elu, right? When you have a machlokes or something kosher or something treif, elu v'elu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is makabel both decisions as legitimate. Okay, elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim. But when you come to a question, is there such a thing as Gilgul, or is there no such thing as Gilgul? It's not really that possible to say, oh, they're both right. One is right, one is wrong. So how do you resolve it? I honestly don't know. Meaning, all I can say is that based on the consensus of people, of great Gedolei Olam, from after the Arizal's time, the Emunah and Gilgul seems to have been Makubal, Ramchal and the like. So as a result, it's become part of our belief. But that's why I do tell people, if you don't believe in Gilgul, it wouldn't be possible to call you an apikoros. That's all I'm saying. Meaning, I wouldn't call Gilgul an eker of Emunah, simply because Rav Saadia Gaon, and probably the Rambam too, did not believe to the idea of Gilgul. But a lot of things we just don't resolve. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of another machlokes, maybe the same answer. The Rambam's position in the Moreh Nevuchim is that there's no such thing as shadim. The Rambam does not believe in demons. Even though there are many Gemaras that talk about shadim in Maseches Brachos, the Rambam says this is a mashal, this is a parable, no such thing as shadim. The Vilna Gaon, in the Bir Hagra to the Shulchan Aruch in Yoredeya, says the Rambam is making a mistake, and he has been led astray by his preoccupation with the accursed Greek philosophy that everything has to be rational and everything has to make sense. He was led astray by philosophia ha'arura, he says, by the accursed philosophy. And if Chazal say there are demons, of course there are demons. How dare the Rambam say there are no demons? So somebody asked the Kotzker Rebbe the same question that you're asking about Gilgul, and that is the halacha like the Rambam? Is the Metzias like the Rambam or like the Gra? So the Kotzker Rebbe said, for sure there are demons, like the Gra says, but once the Rambam paskins there are no demons, then they stop to exist. The demons also have to listen to the psak of the Rambam. So I don't know if we could say it in reverse. For sure there's no Gilgul, but once the Arizal says there's Gilgul, there becomes, okay, you really can't do it in that direction, I think, but maybe something along those lines. See, the question you're asking is really part of a much bigger question, and that is, to what degree did Rishonim or Gaonim have Chachmas HaKabbalah? Meaning, are we allowed to assume that they didn't have access to certain layers of wisdom?
Saadia Gaon has a parish on
Sefer Yetzirah, that's correct. On the other hand, there are those who actually learn that Sefer Yetzirah, I mean, I can't say I'm an expert on Rav Saadia Gaon's parish and Sefer Yetzirah, but some Sefer Yetzirah was not a Kabbalistic work. It could be understood as a mathematical work, meaning there are actually non-Kabbalistic understandings of Sefer Yetzirah. It is true that later the Arizal and the Gra interpret Sefer Yetzirah as a work of Kabbalah, but it wasn't automatically understood that way by the earlier commentators. Yeah?
If someone was like, is really sick for a while, and they're in a lot of pain and they're basically in the hospital, not really existing so much, how do we go about it in regards to, should we daven for them to have a nace and they should get better, or should we daven that they should be nifter and their pain should go away?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, a very painful question. So you're talking about somebody who has a lingering, serious illness?
Someone has cancer for a couple years.
Yeah. So here's the thing. There is a Ran in Maseches Nedarim, a very, very famous Ran, where the Ran says, if a cholah is suffering excruciating pain, and we're not able to relieve that pain is just going to be there, the Ran in Maseches Nedarim says, you are allowed to daven that the person should die. You're not allowed to kill him. You're not allowed to do anything to kill him, but you are allowed to daven that Hashem should take him out of his misery. And the Ran brings a raya to something that's even more dramatic by Rav Yehuda HaNasi. Rav Yehuda HaNasi had excruciating pains. It seems to be stomach cancer, actually. That seems to what is being described. And the Chachamim were davening for him. They were davening. And the Shifcha of Rebbe, realized that as long as they're davening for Rebbe, that Malach HaMavis will not be able to take his neshama. So what she did was, she took a vase, and she smashed it on the floor of the Beis HaMedrash. And for 1 second, everybody stopped davening because they were shocked by the noise. In that 1 second, Rav Yehuda Malach HaMavis was able to take the neshama because there was no davening. So the Ran says that indirectly, she didn't do anything to his body that caused him to die, but indirectly, she caused the stopping of davening. So the Ran says, Hu Adin, you're allowed to daven. So there is actually a makor that you can daven that a person should die. But what's interesting is most poskim today don't like to go in that direction. And they basically say that you try to make it neutral. You try to daven in such a way that Hashem has different alternatives. In other words, you say, I pray to Hashem that he shouldn't suffer. I pray to Hashem that he should be besimcha. Now that could be by refuah, that could be by death, but you don't have to ask for death. But you can say he should not suffer. So that's the better way of doing it. Yeah.
If we have a point which Rabbi Dochon says, complete trust and faith in Hashem is going to take care of all our needs, then do we still need to, or should we still pray? And if so, why?
So you're asking the interesting question, if a person is supposed to have complete and utter trust in Hashem, then why should I pray? That's what you're saying? Yeah. So I think the short answer is that sometimes Hashem puts me in a situation, so I'll pray. Meaning to say, the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, why were the imahos barren? Sarah was barren till she was 90 years old. Rivka was barren. Rachel was barren. Why? Why did Hashem not give them children right away? So it says, because Hashem yearned for their davening. And therefore Hashem created circumstances so you'll reach out to Hashem. Now, let's imagine how this plays out, because this is an interesting question. Sarah Imenu was married to Avram Avinu for many, many years. Sarah has no children. What if Sarah were to say the following? Sarah is 85 years old. She says, I always wanted a child. That was the dream of my life. But if Hashem did not give me a child, it must be Latova, Gamzu Latova. So I accept Hashem's Gezerah with simcha. I don't complain. Whatever Hashem does is for the good. So we would hear a woman say that, and we would say, what a tzadekes, what a righteous woman. Hashem kaviyachol would be pulling out his hair. Hashem would say, she's missing the point. The whole point was I want her to daven. And now she's saying, Kam Zulatova, I don't daven. You see what I'm saying? In other words, to say, I have bitachon, so I don't daven, may be missing the very reason why Hashem created the idea here. Now, this does mean a real paradox in human existence. A very difficult question. We can call it a plan A and a plan B. Suffering happens. My first response is to daven. But we also have another response. Kol ma di'avid rachmana. Whatever God does is good. So when is it my attitude? Daven, storm the heavens, keep on going. And when is it your avodah to say, I accept? Because there is a point at which a person says, I accept. There's a mitzvah of Yaakov Kamenetsky, a very interesting story. Maybe it's a little hard to fully grasp, in which a child had a terminal devastating illness. And the parents were taking the child all over the world for medical treatment and also for brachas. They were going to this tzaddik and that tzaddik and that tzaddik and that tzaddik. And they finally come to Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, and they tell him the whole story. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was not only a gadol b'Torah, but I know myself was the kindest, gentlest person you might imagine. Exquisitely sensitive to human emotion. Rav Yaakov said, do you have other children? And they said, yeah. And he said, may you have nachas from your other children. He basically told them, your kid's going to die. So the truth is, the mishpacha that were there were shocked. What is he doing? The child died shortly thereafter. And the parents said they were actually very grateful to Rav Yaakov. Because Rav Yaakov told them, the time for Tefilah has passed. Now you have to accept. And that way, he said, that way, we didn't have to schlep our child. He could be at home. He could be in his bedroom. He could have friends visit him. He could be with his siblings. He could be, more menuchas hanefesh for the child himself. But if you're a parent, you never know. When do you keep on going, pushing? When do you say, we accept? Rav Yaakov held there is a certain point in which your avodah is to accept. Now, not everybody agrees with that. Particularly in Eretz Yisrael, you'll often hear in Breslov, other places, the idea that there is no such thing as ever accepting a situation until it happens. Once the person dies, you accept. But until that moment, you storm the heavens. On the other hand, Rav Yaakov, seems to indicate that there's a modality of Tefilah. Of course, the Tefilah may he not suffer. That's always, like I said, that always is a good Tefilah. But there's a modality of Tefilah, and then there's a modality of Gam Zulatova. So it's a hard question. I'm not giving you a definite answer on that, but this is where you kind of combine both aspects. Yeah?
So if you're a man and you don't have children, right, and you marry a woman, and then, after trying, you both come to learn that she cannot have children.
She cannot have children, yeah.
Are you obligated to divorce her?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting halacha. The Mishnah says, and the Shulchan Aruch so paskins, that even without a definitive diagnosis, it says if you're married to a woman for 10 years and there are no children, so the halacha is that you, in the time of the Gemara, you took another wife, but today you would divorce your first wife and marry again in order to be Makayim, Pru, or Vu. The exception to that rule is that if you move to Eretz Yisrael, you start the 10 years again, because maybe Eretz Yisrael has a special zechus. So if I was married in the diaspora for 10 years, and then I moved to Israel, we get another 10 years, as it were. So today, of course, because of the ban of Rabbeinu Gershom, we don't have the option of marrying another wife. So the question would be, does that mean any man who's capable of having children, who married a woman who, for whatever reason, is not able to have children, is he mechuyev to divorce her and marry in order to be Makayim Pru Urvu? So the Ramah says a very unusual formulation. He says, in truth, there may be such an obligation, but we don't tell them to do it. We don't enforce it. Because there is shalom bayis. You can't just tell a man, oh, get rid of your wife, find another wife. That's not the way marriages work. So practically speaking, we generally would not encourage it. Even though Medina de Gemara, there is such a makam. I remember hearing years ago, I'm going to say something that is a totally unsubstantiated rumor, but I'll say it because I heard it, and I'm sure I'll get some flack if it's not correct. That Lubavitcher Rebbe, as you know, did not have biological children of his own. So what I heard many years ago was every 10 years, to fulfill the halacha that if you're married 10 years without children, you divorce your wife, he gave his wife a get and then remarried her. Baruch Hashem, he was not a Kohen, and remarried her again to technically be Makayim the halacha of divorce after 10 years, even though obviously he didn't marry another wife. So I don't know. I have no idea if that's true. But as I say, the minhag ha'olam is not. I mean, listen, the chazon ish didn't have children. He was not megarish. So l'maisa, you actually see. Although again, I can't know whose issue it was, but you see the minhag of our gedolim was not to do that. So the Ramah basically says we're not miyayitz to do such a thing. Yeah.
Is that to say that, for example, let's say a couple can't have children, they decide, a frum couple decide to adopt because they can't have children. Do we say that those children are like their spiritual children? Are they Makayim Pru Urvu through raising those kids? Like,
yeah.
How does that work?
Very, very interesting question. Adoption. Adoption is, of course, an option. By the way, is it better to adopt a Jewish child or is it better to adopt a non-Jewish child and convert the baby? There is a... So the emes, like this, the emes is, it's vadai a bigger mitzvah to adopt a Jewish child, no question. But adopting a Jewish child is halachically more complicated because if you don't know the parentage situation, a Jewish kid might be a mamzer if it came from adultery or whatever it would be. Masha'en came a non-Jewish child who gets converted, that erases whatever there was. So the truth of the matter is, for most people who adopt non-Jewish children and convert them, and maybe for another question we'll talk about the geiris for ketanim and how you do that and the like. Maybe if you want to follow up, I'll talk about that a little bit. But in terms of your immediate question, so the question becomes, if I do not have biological children, but we adopt a baby and we raise the baby, am I Makayim Pru Urvu by adoption? So there is a machlokes. There is a Gemara that says, kallah megadel chosson v'yasayma b'teich beisai. Anybody who raises an orphaned child in their home, maila olav hakosov ki'ilu yoldei. The Torah considers it the same as if you gave birth to them. That's a Gemara. So there was a great 19th century gadol, Rav Shlomo Kluger, who was phenomenally proficient. He wrote, I think, more than 300 svarim. And he paskind, al pi this Gemara, that if you raise a child in your home, you are Makayim Pru Urvu through the adoption. However, I have to say, to be honest, that Rav Shlomo Kluger's psak is a das yachid ma'ot, and the overwhelming majority of poskim, including Rav Moshe Feinstein, say that although it's a mitzvah to raise a child and give a child a home, it's certainly gemilas chesed. It's a kindness, it's a great thing, but technically you are not Makayim Pru Urvu, and the statement of the Gemara that it's as if you gave birth to them is a reference to a spiritual level of raising them, but not that you're Makayim Pru Urvu. So it is a machlokes. Rav Shlomo Kluger says you are Makayim Pru Urvu, everybody else says not. Yeah.
You say like they're spiritually connected in a sense, like they were meant to have those neshamas and raise them, or?
Well, I can't automatically say they were meant to have those neshamas, but certainly Chazal say the same thing, by the way, that even if someone is not an orphan. It says, Kol Amlami ben Chaveiro Torah. If I teach your child Torah, in a sense, they become my children as well, right? So there are many, many ways you create spiritual parental connections. You raise a child, you teach a child Torah, right? These are spiritual connections. But it may not translate into the concrete pru or revu. Yeah.
What is your opinion about Anti-Zionism, and what would your response be to their claim that they're protecting other Jews by letting the world know that they are different than
Yeah, so what is my opinion about Neturei Karta and their claim that they are actually protecting Am Yisrael by making it clear that not all Jews believe in the evil Zionist state? So I think you have to differentiate, between the philosophical view of Neturei Karta and the way it plays out in modern society. The view of Neturei Karta, that it's forbidden to establish a state until the coming of Mashiach, is a view that has sources in Chazal. You can argue with those sources, but it's based on this famous sugya in Maseches Ksuvos, Kuf Yud Aleph, that we took an oath that we would not try to gain Eretz Yisrael by force of arms. I've discussed many, many times, I don't want to repeat it again, that there are different ways of interpreting those Makoros, but to say that there's no Makor for the idea that we shouldn't have had a state in 1948, that would be untrue. There actually is a source for their argument and the like. But here's the problem. Let's even assume, just to be devil's advocate for a moment, that Neturei Karta was correct. We should not have made a state of Israel in 1948. I'm not saying that's my shita, but let's assume that that was the shita. What do you do now, 70 years later, when you have, how many, 8 million? How many Jews are in Israel right now? Was that what? How much?
7 or 8 million.
Yeah, close to 8 million Jews. Do you now say, oh, let's disband the state, let's give it over to Palestine? You have to be realistic, just as a matter of pikuach nefesh, meaning even if you're not a Zionist, you got a real problem with pikuach nefesh in endangering the lives of Jews here. Which means to say, in fact, Chabad took that. That's really Chabad's position, although they don't put it that way. If you go back to the Rebbe Rashab, Rav Shalom Dov, going back in 1920s, he was an anti-Zionist. He brought the same sources as Neturei Karta. The 3 O's, not allowed to have a state, etc. This was back in the 20s. Chabad became so Zionistic. So the Rebbe himself said, I'm not Zionistic. I got millions of Jews here. I got to worry about their protection and their lives. We'll call it pragmatic Zionism rather than ideological Zionism. So that's where I have a problem with Neturei Karta. If they're talking about now dismantling the state, there'll be peace. Oh, sure, in a Palestinian state, we'll have access to everything. And as a result, I think their taina that they're protecting the Jewish people, I don't think is very accurate at all. I think it's exactly the opposite. By creating a case that the Zionists are evil and the state of Israel is evil, they're justifying what Hamas does. Hamas says, bi'arta ra mikirbecha, we're eradicating, evil from the world. After all, this rabbi says that these people are evil. So I think it's ifcha mistavra. I just think the problem is that they're not looking at the mitzvah. So in many, many ways, I don't want to call anybody evil. I don't want to call Jews evil. Just like I wouldn't call Chiloni Russia, I wouldn't call Neturei Karta Russia. Many of them have Yiras Shamayim, but I think they're a little crazy. That's part of the issue. They're simply not understanding or choosing not to understand the mitzvahs, and they have, an overly optimistic view of how much the Arabs love us and want peace and we will dwell together in harmony, as it were. It's just not the way it is. Yeah.
What exactly is Baal Tashgis? I feel everyone just throws around the term Baal Tashgis whether you're throwing food from lunch or this or that. What actually is
Yeah. So Baal Tashgis, Baal is just the Mishnaic formulation for low Tashgis, is actually in this week's Parsha, Parshas Kiseitze, where the Torah says, when you wage war against the city, you are not allowed to destroy the fruit-bearing trees. So it's a very specific context. Don't destroy the trees that bear fruits, because that is a destructive act, and ki ha'adam eitz hasada is a tree, a man, an enemy. that you should destroy. So really, many actually say that the Isser D'Oraisa of Baal Tashgis, the Isser D'Oraisa, is a very limited Isser. It refers specifically to cutting down fruit-bearing trees if they bear a certain amount of fruit. I remember years ago, Rabbi Yashiv's apartments, I'm not sure if it was his final place, but one of the places where he lived. So you walked in, it looked like those, I mean, it was a very simple building, but in the middle, there was a big tree that, there was a hole in the roof, and the tree was growing past the hole, meaning they had to build a whole building around the fruit tree because he would not let them cut down the fruit tree. So they had the whole building was with the tree there and the like. Now the Gemara says if the tree produces very little fruit or the fruit is not edible, there are situations where you can cut it down, but b'derech klal you don't cut down fruit trees. Now, Chazal say, however, and the machlokes is it dorais or drabanan, that from the fruit tree we generalize to a general principle that you don't destroy things unless there's a constructive purpose in destroying them. So that would refer to not throwing away foods, food to go to waste, or whatever it is, not throwing away clothing, not destroying things. So there's a general concept of conserving resources, not destroying them. But it is interesting because the Gemara does say that sometimes destruction can have a positive benefit. It mentions that for kings, when kings would die, they used to burn the property of kings as if to show that als kavod of the king, nobody's ever going to use this again. And Chazal say that that was not considered Baal Tashgis because that was an expression of kavod. Now, the same thing with food. You got to be careful about it. Sometimes they say, oh, you got to finish everything on your plate because it's Baal Tashgis. I mean, the truth is, if you're really not hungry and you're being used as a garbage disposal, forgive me, the truth is, eating the food is Baal Tashgis. It's there's no mila in putting it in your mouth versus putting it in the garbage in a case like that. But it does mean that we should not just waste things. So, for example, if you wanted to be a recycler, one could argue that recycling would be in the spirit of Baal Tashgis. Yeah.
So the Rav was saying in the Tanakh shir regarding Hizkiyahu that's the makor for the fact that we learned that up until the last second of the blade being on the person's neck, meaning Hashem can change the decree and save a person even up until the very last.
Right. That's the main raya of the Breslov that says you never give up davening. Then that's correct. Yeah.
So my question is, how can we use that raya there for Hizkiyahu, because Hizkiyahu ended up having that wicked child, meaning we use the proof that Hizkiyahu should not, he should have children, right? Because Hashem could change the decree up until any second, but he really did have a wicked child.
I hear the question, but let me just remind you, Hizkiyahu's Tefilah was not that he should have a righteous child. Hizkiyahu's Tefilah was he shouldn't die from his illness, meaning he was very, very ill. He was on the verge of dying. His Tefilah took away the gezerah of Misa. I mean, that's the particular context. So it's not referring to what type of child he was going to have. Yeah. Okay, yeah, you heard that.
A lot of svarim say they're printed in Arizal.
Yeah.
Is there any mila of a sefer being printed in Arizal, or China or America? Is there any spiritually inherent value, or?
So I'm gonna tell you two trivial hints about the printing of svarim. Whenever a sefer says printed in Eretz Yisrael or Israel, it's either a Turei or someone who doesn't hold of the Medina. Otherwise, it'll say printed in Israel. Right? That's one thing. Another thing is, when you look at a hakdama of a sefer, and the author, the mechaber, will give hakaras hatov to different people, so it depends. Whenever you see a name with an initial, it doesn't say HaRav, but it says Todasi Nesuna La, and it'll say an initial. It'll just say an initial with a period. That means it's a woman. So you could say, he doesn't want to say, for example, I'll give you one example I just came across. I was just laughing. I was reading, the biggest expert on piyutim in the world. Piyutim, wonderful one, is a frum woman, a religious woman. She teaches at Hebrew University. Her name is Shulamit Elitzur. She really is she knows her stuff. So I was reading another sefer on piyutim, and the hakdama of the sefer said, Todasi Nisuna HaRav so-and-so, and then it says, Ula Professor Shin period Elitzur. I happen to know that Shulam is Elitzur. And so those are some bibliographical points. I have a Sefer on Mishlei that was written, very, very beautiful Sefer on Mishlei, that was written by an initial period somebody. It was a woman. Okay, but the question you're asking, but you're not asking that question, you're asking, is there some Maila in the Sefer being printed in Eretz Yisrael proper, L'may nafkamina, if it's printed in Eretz Yisrael, or it's printed in New York? I don't think there's any intrinsic Maila, but the Maila would be that in Hilchei Tzedakah, there is a mitzvah to support Aniyei Eretz Yisrael over Aniyim in places other than your own city. So it could be that if by buying the Sefer you're giving some parnasa to people in Eretz Yisrael may not have a parnasa, so maybe there's a shtickle kiyum of Aniyei Eretz Yisrael or kaidmim, the Aniyei Iracheres. Yeah.
Yes. Is it true to say that most Sephardim in the world were frum up until the establishment of the state of Israel, where they were forcibly secularized by the state?
Yeah, interesting question. Is it true to assume that most Sephardim were religious until 1948, when there was kind of a forcible assimilation? So here is, I think, what is true. It is very, very true that the different deviant movements of conservative or reform and the like are Ashkenazic creations. Sephardim did not have a reform movement bichlal. Sephardim were much more traditional cultures. I can't say for sure if let's say 100 years ago or 150 years ago, everybody was Shomer Shabbat 100%, but certainly it was very, very traditional, and there was no movements against halacha, except maybe the small number of people who followed Shabtai Tzvi, and that existed in Sephardim as well, but that was always a small number, the Donama, whatever it would be. So I think it's largely true that Sephardic culture was much more traditional and halachic adhering than the Ashkenazim. That's true. And unfortunately, with the Yaldei Tehran and the like, unfortunately, the early years of the State of Israel did tremendous havoc. A lot of this is also something we need to go into at some point. A lot of the bitterness that the Haredi world, or the Sephardic world as well, feels towards the State of Israel is not so much what the state is doing now. It goes back to 1948. The earlier years of the state, their mamish were religious kids who not only were made to be non-religious, but they were even kidnapped from their families and placed with other families. Parents were told that their kids are dead. Can you imagine this? They were told their kids are not alive, and the kids were told the parents are dead, and they were put into anti-religious kibbutzim, and that creates tremendous bitterness. The state of Israel is not as bad; it would not do that today. I'm going to tell you that. But a lot of the bitterness and hatred comes from those early memories. So I think you do have a good point. And even today, there are many Sephardim who are not Shomer Shabbat, both here and in America, but the only shul they'll go to is a frum shul. All right, in Eretz Yisrael you don't have that much of a choice. I know in America, the guy who drives on Shabbat, he will not allow. I remember something about. I remember being in Washington, where this Sephardi guy, he was not religious at all, but there was some talk in his shul about getting a woman rabbi, and he said, absolutely not. So asur, and he was going on, asur. He says he will not allow it, no matter what. He doesn't keep Shabbos, but when it comes to the Beit Knesset, everything has to be right. Right? The Beit Knesset is holy. The Beit Knesset has to be halacha. What I do privately, okay, I do privately is my thing. So Sephardim always had a great, great appreciation of Kedushat Beit Knesset. They don't talk during davening at all. Very, very strict. They say everything together. Sometimes it's very long. Sometimes when I'm in New York, I daven in a Sephardic minyan, but if you hope to get in and out relatively quickly, not going to be the case. Nice, sit down for at least 3 hours, 3.5 hours. Every word of Sukkah de Zimra, and the like. So they do have that sense of connection, very much so.
What do you So there, I think it's the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah that says when you the larger, it's better to daven with the sibur. Like the larger the sibur is better. And a lot of places they have like 10 different minyanim at the same time. Even in like some yeshivas, whatever, it's like 2 minyans going on at the same time. Isn't it better to daven all as one?
Yeah, there's no question that based on a pasuk in Mishlei, B'raiv am hadras melech, in the multitude of people is the glory of the king. There is no question, it's brought down beferish in the Shulchan Aruch based on the Gemara, that if you have 2 minyanim to go to, you go to the larger shul. You should go to a larger shul. You shouldn't fragment and have small shuls. There is greater glory to Hashem for everybody coming together. No question about it. The Nakuda is like this, though. The Nakuda is you got to make a comparison. And let's assume that in the smaller minyan, I can have more kavanah. I can concentrate better. They daven slower. So the question becomes a balancing question. There's Raiv Am that says go to the biggest minyan that you can. But then there's also the idea of davening b'kavanah. So is it better to go to a smaller minyan with more kavanah or to a larger minyan with less kavanah? So here, many poskim in fact say that if it's not an equal kavanah situation, the kavanah will be more important than the Raiv Am.
I guess my question is more like, why do Jewish institutions allow this?
Well, I think they allow it precisely because...
Like in the same building.
No, I understand that, but I think that is gufa because the institution understands, hopefully that'll be the reason, that people will have more kavanah in smaller groups. I mean, this is why, for example, if you have a smaller yeshiva minyan that breaks off from a balabatim minyan, right? Let's say Young Israel minyan, it'll hopefully be because they want to have a slower davening, they want to have more kavanah. The balabatim might not want a slower davening. So that would be a justification. But you are correct. You shouldn't just automatically assume, let's just break off and make minyanim. In fact, halachically, there is a strong preference for one big minyan. Ad kedei kach, by the way, the Vilna Gaon says this even applies at a meal. If you're given a choice, should I make kiddush myself as a guest, or should I have the balabayas be motzing me? It's a machlokes. One mandi amar, one shita says, making it your own is better, based on a Gemara that you learned in Maseches Kedushin. Mitzvah bo, yoser mebishlucha, right? Your mamish just learned it. Mitzvah for me to do it more than a shaliach. But the counter argument the Vilna Gaon says is, Raivam, by one person being motzi, a group of people, they're glorifying Hashem as a group rather than individuals. So the shita of the Gra actually is, it's better to have the balabayas be motzi you in Kiddush, and that overrides mitzvah bo yoser mebishlucha. So you are correct, there's a kalas reish in people just figuring they're going to make their own little breakaway minyanim. It's not such a pasha thing. Okay, last question. Yeah.
Does the Satmar Rebbe hold that the state of Israel is stopping Mashiach from coming?
You're referring to the present Satmar Rebbe? I mean, the original of Iyov. Yeah. He basically felt it was stopping the Mashiach from coming. Yeah. He felt it was a Ma'aseh Satan. In fact, when people would ask him about the 6-day war, where you seem to have seen the miracles of Hashem, so it's interesting. He actually said, wasn't a miracle. Israeli army won. That's interesting. Says they won b'derech hateva. So he didn't see any unusual Yad Hashem in the 6-day war. There's a huge book. Maybe you've seen this huge book. It's you gotta be a weightlifter to move it around. It's called The Empty Wagon by Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro. It's like must be 1,000 pages or more. And Yaakov Shapiro is an interesting person. He's an American Rav who is related to the Satmar Rebbe, and he is a Naturi Karta, and really a Naturi Karta person. And he compiles like every anti-Zionist statement that any gadol ever made in history. So if you ever want to know the complete history of anti-Zionism and Naturi Karta, that's a good place to go. But he only presents one side. He literally he presents no zechus whatsoever for the other side. So it's not a balanced book, but l'chol hapachot, it is a collection of Munkach and Satmar and all of those things. Okay, be well and take care.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Ech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.